So there was a headline that grabbed my attention earlier, and when I tell you, you'll see why. The headline was China bans Ramadan. Fasting and taking part in religious activities forbidden in controversial crackdown on minority Uyghur Muslims. Okay, so this is from The Independent, but it's quoted in a lot of other sources as well. And this is the opening paragraph. Chinese authorities across the country's rest of northwest region of Xinjiang have banned Muslim students and civil servants from taking part in all religious activities during the holy month of Ramadan. In a region where around 45% of the population is Muslim, a series of notices issued by schools and government departments have strictly forbidden anyone from taking part in fasting, and some have even been banned from performing their daily prayers in mosques. Now, you can imagine the outcry if this was in a country like Britain or France. There'd be a massive outcry from imams, from the left, from people across the board saying, oh, look how Islamophobic these governments are being. But when China does it, it's reported, but I don't see the same level of outrage, and that strikes me as quite strange. This, no doubt, is in the context of some events that have taken place this year. There's been a number of terrorist attacks, and let's call them for what they are. They were terrorist attacks. Deliberately targeting civilians is terrorism, whatever way you try to gloss it over. For example, in the largest city in Xinjiang, Urumqi, and quite a lot of Chinese civilians have been killed this year. Earlier in the year there was a terrorist attack in Kunming. Now, at the time I condemned that attack, and I still condemn it. I will always condemn attacks on civilians. And I've also argued that violent Islamism is a problem around the world. So what is happening in China is, in a way, part of a wider reflection of violent Islamism. Look at ISIS in Iraq, look at Boko Haram in Nigeria. It's a worldwide problem. And I intend to make other videos specifically about Islamism. But in this video I want to talk a little bit about Islamism in the Chinese context. Now, there's a group that's active in this region called the East Turkestan Front, which has been banned by not just China but several other states and bodies as a terrorist organisation, which it may well be. But there's a lot of issues in the Xinjiang region that the Chinese government isn't exactly reporting, which is similar to Tibet. The difference is in Tibet there isn't necessarily, well, there isn't an Islamist movement, and Tibetans for the most part haven't responded with force, whereas the persecution in Xinjiang there has been a response by force. Now, quite often when I've seen Chinese people criticise the West, it's often things like, oh, look at what you do in the Middle East, you kill lots of Muslims in the Middle East. My response to that is to reflect on the astonishing hypocrisy of China. Because, for number one, whilst there has been terrorist attacks, and whilst it's entirely understandable that the Chinese government wants to crack down on that, by banning an entire religious event, it's collective punishment basically of all Chinese Muslims. And China has quite a large number of Muslims. So in other words, because of what the East Turkestan Front done, or because of what Islamist groups have done, every Chinese Muslim is therefore being held responsible. Now, Ramadan is an absolutely central part of Islamic life. It's an important religious festival, equivalent to Christmas for Christians. Therefore, banning it is a major attack on their culture. So that's a provocative move, and it definitely would support the argument that they have been persecuted by the Chinese state. This is nothing new. If we look back at Chinese history, and it's all censored today, to give you an example of that, this is a book I got in China. It's in English, but it's published by the Education Bureau. It picks and chooses events that it covers. Now, if I look at the 1860s period, bear with me a second. There's a lot of whitewashing in this, but they've got a huge section on, apologies, big section here on the Opium Wars, right? See? Whole section on the Opium Wars. Now look at the date, 1856. If we turn the page, 1861, 1870s, It goes on to talk about philosophers, the treaty system, westernization movement. There's a lot of things in there to do with domestic policy. However, this book is typical of Chinese propaganda. It completely whitewashes what various Chinese governments have done. In this context, I'm talking about the Qing dynasty. Now, between 1862 and 1877, there was an event called the Dungan Revolt. In Chinese, that is Tongzhi Xin Zhang Hui Bian. Apologies if my pronunciation isn't great. Hui in China, by the way, is the word for Muslim, Hui people, although the Uyghurs are also Muslims. But basically, this is also known in China as the Hui Minorities War. But it's barely known in the West, long forgotten in China. I honestly believe most Chinese people wouldn't even know about this because it's whitewashed. But if you look at sources from elsewhere, by all accounts this was a very bloody event. And basically this was brought about by a dispute between a Han trader and a Hui trader over the price of a bamboo pole. The Hui person argued that they were treated unfairly because the Han merchant demanded more money. Now there's a very long history in China of the Han majority trying to subjugate minorities. I'm not saying that's necessarily the case today. In fact, in some areas minorities have more benefits that the Han don't have, especially regarding the one-child policy. But it's indisputable that throughout Chinese history the Han have been guilty of oppressing minorities. And of course there will be denials about that, of course, because China is a country that is extremely dishonest about its own past. So anyway, this revolt between 1862 and 1877, and there was another one in the 1890s, was extremely bloody. By some accounts, as many as 8 million people may have been killed, although I should say that it's very hard to verify this. But by all accounts, it was an extremely bloody event, one of the bloodiest conflicts in Chinese history, which therefore by extension means in world history, because internal conflicts in China are always bloody. So this event, the Dungan Revolt, has largely been forgotten by history. So when I saw this report today, China bans Ramadan, it sort of got me thinking, well, there's actually a long history of oppression of Muslims in China. And I'm not saying it's all one-sided. I mean, I believe Islamism is a cancer in the world, and I don't blame the Chinese government for standing up to specific acts of terrorism, but what we have here is collective punishment, basically saying, because Muslim terrorists attacked Urumqi, Kunming, we're going to punish all Chinese Muslims by depriving them of a religious festival as a very central part of their culture. And I think it's going to backfire. I mean, the Chinese state is sowing the seeds of violence that is going to come. And I despise Islamism. I hate what they do. And there's no excuses for what they do. But, you know, these movements don't just begin out of thin air. There's always a background to it. And that's not the same as making an excuse. But if you think that the Chinese state is innocent, you're incredibly naive. Because the Dungan Revolt is just one example of many incidents in Chinese history where minorities were oppressed, and in many cases they were Muslim minorities. I also think it's very strange that Islamic commentators tend to avoid this. They're very quick to attack Britain and America, but they avoid the persecution of Muslims in China, which has a very long history. I think partly it's because the Chinese state massively censors its own crimes, completely whitewashes it. I mean, this was a major historical event. It sort of overlapped with the Taiping Rebellion, which was a civil war at that time. That might be one explanation as to why it's largely been forgotten. The Taiping Rebellion, on the other hand, is one of the civil wars in Chinese history that is remembered. But, you know, by all accounts, this was an extremely bloody event. And basically, its origins were the persecution of China's Muslim minorities. The Qing dynasty had a reputation for ruthlessly crushing any sort of dissent, not just Muslims but others as well. I'll put the Wikipedia entry, and before people say, oh, Wikipedia is not reliable, It's true that Wikipedia has errors, but they cannot have an entire article which goes on for at least 10 pages based on a one big lie, because the article will be closed down as being inaccurate. So yes, Wikipedia has flaws, but people have to quote sources, and I'll put a link to that. This was a historical event, and China censors it basically, as it does with so many things. So what I'm saying is, terrorism can never be justified. The attacks on innocent Chinese civilians cannot be justified, but tensions in this region didn't just begin this year. Look back at 2009, there was tensions between local Uyghurs and the Han majority, and there was very bloody ethnic riots. And I'm not saying it, I'm not pointing fingers and saying it's all the Han's fault. I'm sure it works both ways, but at the same time, China has a long history of repressing its minorities, despite propaganda to the contrary. I mean, the state will say, we value our minorities, but this actually flies in contradiction to that. If China values its minorities, why is it enacting collective punishment of all its Muslims? So, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy here, both China lecturing the West on what's on intervention in the Middle East, whereby a lot of Muslims have died, but a lot of that, by the way, has been at the hands of Islamists, and then whitewashing Chinese history, where millions of Muslims have been killed. Millions. It's not an exaggeration. There's also some hypocrisy from the Islamic world itself, which seems to completely ignore this, and yet obsess over Israel, Britain and America. So, if it's all about the Ummah and Muslim Brotherhood, why not speak out about oppression in China? That seems hypocritical to me.